by students and student organizations, and we owe them all a great debt for putting this important event together. And so my role really is to extend a welcome. Thank you to all of you on behalf of the college, and in particular on behalf of President Frank, who could not be here today, but very much wishes that he were. In terms of the events of the convocation today, one of the main organizers of the event, Raymond Hofstad, will walk you through that. But before he comes up, I just wanted to again say on behalf of the college, our thanks to him and to many others that do identify to put this event together. Brandon?
We'd like to thank everyone for coming and joining us to celebrate one day here visited. 34 years ago, on May 15, 1968, Augsburg opened its doors and its mind to address and explore one of the most pressing issues within the U.S., the issue of race. Today, under the spirit of the original One Day in May, the Augsburg community has once again opened its doors to confront some of the most important current social justice issues. Today we will celebrate our rich history, educate our community, and recognize the importance of our diversity, not only here at Augsburg, but here in Park, Minneapolis. I'm looking forward to this wonderful and exciting day for open discussion and dialogue. Before we continue, I would like to recognize all those that have made this day possible. And I would like to first and foremost start off with the Coalition for Student Activism. And I'm going to list out their names and take a stand. They're probably going to hate me for this, but I think it's well deserved. So some of them are here and some of them aren't. Some of them are working over in the Christensen Center, so they're not here to still give them a call. So. Mike Coleman, Kelly Graham, Elso Maxwell, Katie Nielsen, Carrie Strobel, Jared Zimmerman, Katie Bigelow. So if you could just join me. Also, I'd like to thank a couple of very important people and groups that helped out with this day as well. Joe El-Kati, the advisor to the coalition, Joe Young, Mary Laurel True and Mary Benasuti, Jim Charleston Porter, Ian Kimball for offering the welcome today, Betty Wade, Heidi Kazeta, Rosina Fuller, Jeff Stafford, and then also Pastor Lane QSU Sociology Club students and ASAC. So, and of course the Parent Scholars Program. Without that, I don't think I could have gotten so but we could have worked on this together. So, and again, I apologize if I forget anything. So, I would also like to offer a special thanks to our participants because, of course, without them, we would never have this day. And specifically, Pastor Ernestine and Mahmoud comes today, we would like to thank him as well. So, and then finally, I would like to thank Jerry for coming and offering the music today, so she's really good. With that, I would like to introduce our first guest. Kenesha is currently a senior biology major here at Augsburg. She's also a part of the Ronald E. McNair Scholars Program and a past year member. Kenesha has a wonderful ability of writing and reading poetry. So please join me in welcoming Kenesha Williams as she reads the poem, The Rain Will End.
The rain will end. To some it may seem like just yesterday, vivid memories of the civil rights movement, the marches, the speeches, the sit-ins. For others, we recall the stories told to us, how our grandmothers and grandfathers cried while trying to keep up the hope for the future of our mothers and fathers. The stories that told us about the chaos, the order, the hatred, and the love. Stories that echo thunder heard miles away. Today we awake to a new day, a day in which the storm has begun to clear, but it still rains. It still rains on those who are different, who are of a different race, gender, class, or sexual orientation than the majority. Equality is there, but it is eclipsed by the ignorant, the self-proclaimed elite, that find it so hard to simply be polite to those who are different from themselves. Today is a new day in which some who ridiculed the different years ago have expressed authentic remorse. Others have presented their deepest apology through a script written by a secretary or lines taken from a book. And others have maintained stony hearts and passed on the tradition of discrimination to their children and grandchildren. And still the rain falls. But serenity is near. For years, rusted hearts have persevered. Generations have watched society ripen, and soon its maturation will be complete, and the rain will end. Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank CSA for inviting me. Well, I played there 2 times. First time was in 1972. A benefit for the presidential candidate George Bush. I'm ashamed you went. Well, found out what happened. This is a song about listening. It's the hardest thing for us to do. There's a very careful way of listening that's very beneficial. And I think really what we really need to listen to most of all is the earth. All the aspects of the earth. That's what this song's about. It has a lot to teach us if we listen. Listen to the wind. It carries a song. Listen to a glow. It's gentle. It's strong. Listen with your eyes. It can calm your mind. Drink its sweet wine. Straight from the vine. Listen to the trees. They're calling to you. Listen to the sky sing so blue. Can't you see the rain? Doesn't know its name. Never feels the pain. Doesn't feel the sting. It's always coming down, never going up. It never tried. Horses on the run, they're flying so free, they're breathing in the air, they're just happy to be. They haven't got a care, the wind through their veins, they never feel the need to explain. Shining in the sun, a clear glassy lake. Do what you will, for your heart's going to break. Someday, listen to the wind. It carries a song. Listen to the glow. It's gentle and strong.
Thank you, Mary. That was very nice. Good morning. Today at Augsburg College, we have come together to share in conversations with an array of speakers who dedicated their time to social justice issues. But we must not forget those who come together, who came together 30 years ago here at Augsburg to discuss the issue of race following the assassination of Martin Luther King. These people were our motivation to once again dedicate a day to celebrate diversity and discuss equality. The Coalition for Student Activism is proud to honor Mahmoud El-Kati, who unfortunately cannot be here with us today. We'd still like to honor him. He was one of the original speakers here at the One Day in May in 1968, and currently he is an African American history professor at Augsburg College. He's still a respected advocate for civil rights in the community. In recognizing those who took part in Augsburg history, please welcome Mahmoud El-Kati.
Good morning. Here we go. Really confused. Sure, I'm glad to be here. That's me. And I hope you are too. And anyway, I said about 10 minutes, and that's always unfair. I think when talking about these kinds of things, we tend to repress very important pieces of history. I kind of knew that in 10 minutes, but so I did write some things down. I don't want to get through this in the next 10 minutes or so. First thing I'd like to do is to commend, thank, and recognize the organizers of this commemoration. We don't do this often enough, and it's really a part of our general ethos. Not only about history of the 19th century, but the last 25, 30 years, last generation. People seem to not be able to think about that. So, thank you, whomever was speaking here at Augsburg, for having remembered. That's what keeps us conscious of ourselves as human beings. It is history, it's our history. History has been tackled a lot by a lot of people. Only for history is a collection of lies collectively agreed upon. But not so. You can do things with history. It is in us. It's not something written in a book. It's something that you carry within you. It's not really about the past. It's about the present. Fault in the past, never really past. It's always a part of us. And it's sad to see that we don't know much about this most dramatic period of American history. And when I say we, I'm talking about the nation, by we draw blanks. It's sensible and intelligent, I think, to reflect on experiences which shape our lives. All our lives are shaped by what in the past, what happened yesterday, that's what happens today. Keep saying that. Television we watch happening 24 years ago. Still affecting the next 5 seconds. Because history is a current event. You know, it's a part of us. What happened here in Augsburg in May of 1968 on the heels of Martin Luther King's assassination was a part of the general spirit of awareness and movement of ideas which was taking place in this country. That juncture led largely by students all over the country. This is the first in American history where the student population had become politicized. Not even European students, not even students in places like Brazil, but for Americans. This is the first where students were involved in off-campus political activities. I argue, and I argue this
Americans, private telephone booth, how many goldfishes you can swallow, and you know, all that good stuff. And you know, cap it out with annual spring panty raising in the girls' dormitory. Big teeth. That's what most American students were doing, whatever. Princeton, Yale, Harvard, they were doing that. They weren't really. I don't have those students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat in for freshmen. And that whole growth of consciousness among students that we need to. They started with Black college when they started in knowledge. They might not have known what they were doing before freshmen. They were catalysts and creative agents for conscientizing, as Mandela wrote it, conscientizing the student population in America. I think we can do at Augsburg, I remember well, a very young guy, about 13. Wow! And they had this Father's Day, closing the school and having a teaching sitting, a teaching where people, voices you don't normally heard here in academia, voices from conscious people who were active, who were engaged, some scholars who were organic, engaged with the time and beyond, and other interpreters of the American life beyond the classroom and conventional wisdom of principalities and powers. It happened. It was a great day for the experience, very meaningful and changes. Now, I think it's important to find the climate of those times. Say just a word or two of this, which everything is related to everything. Just as everything has a place, everything is related to everything else. Everything. Ultimately, and this is clear, this is what was happening. It was a paradoxical time. Both Pandora's box was literally. The models that term was let loose in America. Anything good about America was happening right besides everything bad. Comes out of the contradictions of our beliefs, and our professed beliefs that all men are died by the creed of certain equal rights among these life, good and pursuit of happiness is a professed idea which has always been contradicted by the reality of practical power. That's what we live about. And it showed up in the 60s. The struggle for democracy. That's what the struggle is for. That's what Black Americans are struggling for. You can call it race relations and crazy stuff like that. But it's about ideals. It is a struggle for democracy and nothing else. For an open, inclusive society where human beings respect human beings as human beings, a man, a woman, a child, in the discussion. They all have meaning parts and conventions. We can give that evidence. And I think that's what the fight is about. It's not black and white. It's about developing a shared power relationship. There's an imbalance in power relationship revolving around this social construction called race. White on the top, black on the bottom, and other people, and so forth. But I want to make this crystal clear. I don't believe in this issue of race. I acknowledge it, but I don't believe in it. I mean, it exists. It's too powerful to ignore as a political and economic reality. But I think it's utter nonsense. I make that crystal clear. So when I say race, I'm always saying in quotes. They don't really exist. It's like a ghost. You know, people who believe in the visibility of ghosts see them all the time. Right? It's important to define these times. And I just want to say, see if you can, if you're very young, but you heard about some of these things. It was an atmosphere of tremendous creativity, brought largely by young people, their energy, and sometimes aimless energy, misdirected, whatever. The energy comes before we can shape it and give it form to it. The students at Augsburg are going to be committed to at least intellectually related to some of the turmoil that some of them. Here again, just a little bit. The first 3 students who were killed in student activism at the South Carolina State University College in Augsburg, South Carolina, trying to be 7 years old. They were shot in the back, 14 of them were wounded. Well, that's before Kent State in 1970. And another started Black College, Augsburg State University, Augsburg State College, and in Mississippi, the backwater of Mississippi. Probably never heard of a person Steve McNair, who was a football player, did it, Black College, and never know those students were teared down by the state troopers. 1968 began with the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders in Augsburg, the government at that time. We defined it thusly. It was issued and revealed that white racism was the fundamental cause of the rebellions taking place in the cities. I still believe. I think white racism, white supremacy is gone anyway. It's a doctrine, it's an ideology, it is at the root of the problem in America. It was there since the first article, Section 3 of the American Constitution. These 55 men who followed this republic made sure that race mattered. Made sure, it was if you cannot read that document and come up with any other conclusion, people being 3/5 of human beings, other people being, in effect, non-persons, Native Americans, and then the class question of unproperty white classes of people who couldn't even vote, and women were somewhere up there in limbo. They weren't here, they weren't there, they were just whatever. It was somebody's wife or sister or whatever. So it was not democracy. It was a republic, and it still is a Republican form of government, a representative form of government. I was kind of most Americans are going to excuse me for sounding, over there. That this is not a democracy, it's a republic. That's what the John Birch Society used to say. Not a democracy, it's a republic, and let us keep it that way. Representative form of government. It's not a direct democracy. Democracy is struggle. It's a process. It's not a done deal. It's not a it's easy to lose, it's more difficult to win. And its essence is eternal struggle. If you don't struggle, you're not doing democracy. Democracy is something you do, in the words of Thurgood Marshall. Not something you just think about. You have to make democracy, you have to create democracy. And to the extent that democracy exists, people have created the voluntary sector at this beginning. Whether you talk about the abolitionist movement, the women's rights movement, the working class movement, the pension movement, the student movement, and going on. That's what creates democracy. Not Lyndon Johnson. He responds to the pressure of social movement. All governments do that. There is no government ever initiated a social movement for democracy. The great thing about America, the United States, the one great thing is that people are allowed, due to the Bill of Rights, to organize themselves voluntarily to struggle for democracy. Most of us are too lazy to do that. But every now and then, a creative minority comes along and stands up for democracy. Some of them. And that is what in fact has happened in this country. So yeah, students playing that role very early. At various colleges across the country. And one of the major struggles during that time was a struggle to reform the curriculum of American education. The Black Studies movement was the most powerful and influential movement in campuses. Now, I can't go through all the details, but it's clear that when the students sat in at Columbia University, the Black and White Coalition of Students closed Columbia University. Students at Northwestern University, students at Harvard, Yale, and so That's why, by extension, you talk about women's studies, Native American studies, Indian, so that's where that came from. It didn't come out of the sky. And the University of Minnesota didn't create the Black Studies department. Black students did, by taking over Ball Hall in 1969, the year after. That's why you have it. People struggled for that. It wasn't initiated by the principalities in power. And universities didn't go on to initiate stuff from the government level. So that the issue was the struggle for reform, curriculum reform. And shortly thereafter, Dr. Martin Luther King, the year of his assassination, this is when the hell was he was engaged in two most fundamental questions about democracy, that is, economic democracy in this country, when he struggled to organize the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C. How many people remember that? Thank you. I think it's the most radical thing he's ever done. The most radical act by any leader, when he called all of the disaffected, marginalized, oppressed Americans, based on economics. And that meant, yes, Black people, yes, Native Americans, yes, Mexicans, Hispanic, Mexicans. That's an interesting term, I just switched, but we were Mexicans back then. And then, last but not least, critical, with the unpopular class, descendants of poor white people in Appalachia and the Ozarks, Piedmont. You know what I'm talking about? Dollar Parks people. That's what I'm talking about. People that embarrass this country. The ones, whites who were victimized by slavery. And he called all of those people to together. Nobody said multiculturalism. See? Nobody said it just existed. That's already a fact. Multiculturalism. We talk about it now, but we did it in the 60s. People were in fact together for a time. For 6 years, you had a multicultural movement in this country led by Black people. It exists. Now we got avenues like my students, I also do high school thing with students every day because it was my duty to do that. They got all the form. They got the dress, the words, the hairdos, everything. But none of the politics. They're empty-headed. They got all the right militant words. They speak the words of the people exist. But there's no action, no relationship to their lives. They're just doing the hair thing. You have to remind them that to grow your hair like that in the 1960s was a political act. You know, that man with black hair grow. That was an act of politics. Good style program. Try to live good. When a male braids in this society, this super chauvinistic male society, that's feminism. Female. Women braid their hair. People did that. That was an act. And you look at an example, I did it all. With the hair, the braids, the bush, the beard, whatever. Yeah. You couldn't talk to him. You make a political statement. Those are political statements. Now it's form, it's fashion. Martin Luther King was in between two movements. The Memphis movement, the garbage man strike, which simply said it's great, the greatest slogan of the 1960s. I am a man. 200 men at the same time. That's what it's about, President. I am a man, a human being, a person put on this earth by God. I don't want to hear anything about class and race and all of that. I'm a human being. That's the greatest slogan of the 60s. To me, the writing 50 different signs, that what it's reduced to. Yes, I'm poor, yes, I'm white, but I'm a human being, just like you. I have a beating heart. You know, I got it, but you got it. And probably will lead pretty much the same, palpitation of the heart. Great. And he was entranced between two movements. And 100 people set up tents in Resurrection City, as they call it. We will stay here until the government deals with jobs. Deals with jobs and freedom, with the economic question. That was squashed. People in North Minneapolis were very involved in the political campaign. sent busloads of material. Just one more minute. I'm skipping over all the good news. I want to say that every act in the 60s, in that year, did something to raise people's level of understanding. What the students did on campus, taking over administration buildings and so forth, what the students did at the Democratic National Convention, chaotic though it was very educational. People would finally understand what was going on. In Chicago, Luke and his Bible Seal of the Black Panther Party, who did it the only way you could do it. How do you get authority to take it? And I'm not going to let you take it over my life. And so he wouldn't respect the judge. Called Judge out and everything that the child got. And they gagged him. In the court. Everybody remember that? Being tied to the chair and so forth. It was really the Chicago 8. They got sealed out of it. I would not respect this man. Your authority over me is illegitimate. You don't have a right to judge me. You're a part of this oppressive system, which has held my people back for generations. And I'm not going to respect you over your mouth. I'm going to call you out. And he did. That's politics without guns. I mean, it's pretty. The bourgeois society have redeemed itself in the middle of life and civil rights and so forth. And say the wrong word from the judge, and that did a lot. And so it changed American politics, electoral politics forever. That's when they got freedom. That's when women got more power. And other people were allowed into the democratic process. So you got there. This is a different political system than it was in the 1960s. It's like an all-white male club for the most part. That's what both the Democrats and the Republicans look pretty well like that. I know people who form this society, and they've got no credit for it to this very day. They don't become movie stars, not people like that. John Paulus and Tommy Smith had it right when they gave the Black Power salute in Mexico City. Why wanted to crawl at home and run the Olympics? We're going to protest just like the Soviet people who live under the Soviet bloc, protest against oppression. We are an oppressed nationality in America. Black people are an oppressed nationality. They're not a race. That's ridiculous. That's stupid. We call people who look like black people a race. If race is supposed to suggest something pure, that's the most stupid thing in the world. They are a nationality with a given set of experiences, a shared vision, shared visceral values, beliefs that are not shared with anybody else. That's just like saying you're Irish. That's not a color, that's a charade. Right? That's a shame. Right? You understand what I'm saying? It's the other things that make people who they are. It's not your color or your race. It's essentially your culture and your history that gives you your who-ness, your reality as a human being, a specific time, space, group of people. So, the politics change, the way people behave on college campuses changed. They made an adjustment to it, and hasn't changed since. Kind of frozen, crystallized. But let me say something on behalf of I wrote this a long time ago. One of the great anomalies, I think the greatest contradiction between ideal and reality is the struggle of African Americans for democratic rights in democracy. Put simply, the overriding reality of African American history is the struggle for democracy, for the rights so eloquently enunciated in the Declaration of Independence, so simply articulated in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and 1875, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, 65, and 68. The question is, if America can be a society of all its policies of harmless family, if America not indeed a people with the highest respect for law, then why is it that the question of human civil rights for African people, that is to say, the descendants of enslaved African populations, remains such a persistent, vexing question? radical. And to be radical is not to be mean or ugly or tear people or hate people. To be radical is to give fundamental. What is the deal? As the business people say, what is the bottom line? That's what it should be. All people who want social change, right now, with all their experience behind it, should be radical, not radical Republican, but radically committed to the ideals of democracy, to justice, to freedom, to the Judeo-Christian ethic. So you look at that, right? I'm not a Democrat or Republican, I couldn't possibly do that. Or a socialist or a communist or whatever. It's right. I want to deal with the fundamental question of social justice for everybody. The late, I'll stop with this, Nellie Scott Johnson, who was born out of the ghetto on a farm in Minnesota, who became a very important figure in our local history here. Who knows the name? The black woman who died at 93 years old, who helped form the Identifier. Who was the first black elected official in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, as she said. Who was a champion of two movements, women's rights and the labor movement, and three movements, women's rights, the labor movement, and black people's struggle. So that's clear about what I'm fighting for. She was an advisor to Hoover Humphrey and a lot of those guys who was so advanced in civil rights thinking that Nellie Scott Johnson was an advisor. We named a school for her in Minneapolis 6 months before she died. She was born in Lakeville, Minnesota, and moved to Minneapolis when she was about 15. And when she had this job as an elevator operator in one of the hotels downtown, she was making $15 a week. And the man, one of the bosses, wanted to give her a pay cut of $12.50. And that started her to do what she's supposed to do. Organize. She organized the union, her local level, organized it, and was in that struggle. She was a working class woman, she was a seamstress. She said, what about the struggle? And that is this. I never knew a day of hunger in my life. I never knew what it was like to be without food or shelter. And I want that for everyone. Thank you.
In April of 1968, I was in the United States Marine Corps. And I had orders to go to Vietnam the second time. And if it hadn't been for that, I would be standing here today. We're going to involve in peace and justice issues. But I was visiting a friend. Well, I hoped to visit him. As it turned out, he was in Vietnam and his wife was there. This was in Watts. Some of you might know that in 1965, there was a conflagration of incredible proportion in the Watts area in southern Los Angeles. So I was there in April 1968 visiting my friends. I was deep in the heart of Watts. My wife was with me, my children. And we were sitting at the table. All of a sudden there was a knock on the door. And a woman came and handed my friend a note. And my friend read the note and got her down. And her friend left. And my friend looked up and said, I think you better get talks a lot about freedom. And I've thought a lot about freedom. I spent tons of time reading about it, studying about it, thinking about it. I ran across a remarkable book called Ladies A Rod, written by Victor Hugo back in the 1860s. It was all about a man, John called Jean, who ended up serving a 20-year sentence, prison sentence for stealing a loaf of bread. And it was about his search for freedom. It was one of the most remarkable books I ever read. After I finished reading the book, I put the words down to a nomination. I ended up calling Victor's son for several reasons. And these words just came to me. I really feel like I wrote these words alone. They're just given to me. And I was thankful that they were given to me.
My name is free, wild and reckless. I can't be stopped. I'm like the wind. I know no boundaries. I can't be chained up. You can't see. I live with you. I have a sister. Her name is Courage. She's strong as granite, with nerves of steel. She likes bright colors. She's bold scarlet. She will not flinch. She will not yield. We have a father. His name is Justice. We have a mother. Her name is Truth. When we're together, we take down tyrants. We take on demons, the biggest groups. Oh, we helped Gandhi to free his people. Nelson Mandela, we did the same. In Eastern Europe, we helped Alexa. The Iron Curtain came down like rain. We love the Spirit. We loathe the darkness. We bring the light for all to see. And if you need us, we can be silent. Oh, listen closely to what I say. Give up your pride now, we'll come running. Give up your greed and we will fly. Let go of envy, you will find us. Let go of fear now, we're at your side. My name's free. I'm wild and reckless. I can't be stopped. I'm like wind.
Boy, it's really hard to follow something like that. That was a really incredible story and song. I would like to say that I was getting up here to introduce a really good friend of mine, but I'm not yet. But Pastor Erlandson is somebody that I have a tremendous respect for, and primarily this is because he has a really good understanding of what it means to have the reality of practical power, as Mom so articulated. I met Jim Erlandson through the Urban Strategy, which is a collective of 13 urban Lutheran congregations in St. Paul that are interested in urban renewal in the church, and among these things, race and reconciliation in the church. Jim is a graduate of Augsburg College from the class of 1976. He was ordained in 1987, and he has been the pastor at the Lutheran Church of the Redeemer in St. Paul since 1994. Redeemer is a multiracial congregation in the old Rondo neighborhood of St. Paul, which has been going through a lot of urban renewal itself. And as one in the church who has been working to dismantle discrimination of all kinds, Jim, just a year ago, offered his church as the place for the ordination of Anita Hill, the first lesbian Lutheran minister ordained who was open and open relationship in the church. So Jim is quite an incredible man, and just wish him well. Thank you.
Well, Doris, we have a few minutes. You need to get going on. Okay. It's good to be here. Thank you very much, sir. I want to set this in the context of a verse of scripture, which is from the book of Micah. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? I'm a child of the 60s. That means my formative years were spent watching Captain Kangaroo and Lucky Casey on television. My teenage musical tastes were formed by the Beatles, Motown, and 60s rock and roll, which probably categorized me as a dinosaur. My politics were formed by listening to songs by Bob Dylan, hearing the sermons and speeches of Martin Luther King Jr., by Vietnam War protests, and by the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Dr. King, and Robert Kennedy in 1968. In high school, we grew our hair out long as a political statement. And we celebrated the first birthday on a hot day in April in 1972, listening to speeches by Hubert Humphrey, an environmentalist calling on us to save the earth. I was not a participant, but I was an admirer of the Woodstock generation, the peace movement, and political activism on college campuses. People my age actually thought that we could change the world, just like John Lennon said in his song, Revolution. When I enrolled at Augsburg College in 1972, this campus was a much different place than it is today. We worshipped in Melby Hall, we studied music in an old church, and relaxed at Culla's Tavern. We held a rally for George McGovern in 1972, who received my first presidential vote, so I remember that day. Real-life hippies lived in Cedar Riverside. Some still do, I hear tell. And we went to listen to folk music at the Whole Coffee House and Riverside Cafe. In the spring of 1972, there were protests on the University of Minnesota campus against the U.S. bombing and secret invasion of Cambodia. And some Augsburg students actually crossed the Washington Avenue Bridge to join in. Political activism was expected of college students in those days, and sports were passé. At least in colleges where national championships were not the norm. In my sophomore year, Watergate was in full swing, and we had a lot of fun in Professor Miles Stenchel's political science class, presidents, courts, and Congress. During the Watergate hearings, the Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky scandal were nothing in comparison. Every day was a new revelation. When I went to Luther Seminary in St. Paul in the early 80s, the Vietnam War had ended, but the consequences and the fallout were just becoming clear. Refugees from Cambodia and Laos were coming to St. Paul, escaping the killing fields and re-education camps of the communists. In seminary, we debated the pros and cons of liberation theology and whether Marxists or pro-American National Guards in Central American countries were the answer to their country's turmoil. Apartheid in South Africa and Namibia was an injustice we felt called upon as Lutherans to oppose with our divestments from church pension funds, and some of us traveled to Eastern Europe behind the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain to make peace visits to underground Christians. I grew up in a world in which it seemed natural, critical in fact, to know what you believed and to seek to live out your faith and your values in your daily life in the world, which is the title for this speech. Many in my generation believed in racial equality, peace, and
And we who are Christians truly believe that through faith, we could be God's agents of change in this world, and that we could do it through the church. I still believe that. It seems hard to believe, doesn't it, when on the face of it, the church often seems an obstacle to change in principle, and few people have the stomach or the faith to work for peace and justice anymore. As of September 11th, changed everything. When we look at what is happening in the world around us, it's easy to get discouraged. People seem to be more interested in protecting themselves and their possessions than thinking about transformation. It's hard to think about understanding a neighbor when our government is fighting terrorists and sending out monthly warnings about unsubstantiated terrorist threats. The prospects for peace and understanding look dimmer by the day when we observe what is happening in Israel, where Israelis and Palestinians have been at war ever since I can remember. The church seems distracted by its all-consuming reactions to sexual abuse in parishes, ecumenical agreements and disagreements, and the issue of ordaining gay and lesbian clergy. The media says that young people are more interested in making money than doing right, and are watching Survivor, The Bachelor, and surfing the net instead of reading books, thinking great thoughts, and getting to know one another, which is what college is supposed to be all about. Actually, I don't think all that much has changed from my generation of college students to yours. I mean, the appeal of sex, drugs, and alcohol were just as prevalent in the 1970s as they are now, and the majority of Augsburg students didn't attend daily chapel then either. Is there still daily chapel? Thank you, my brother. I want to check in on that. But I know that there's much more to college life than that. So we should always be suspect about media generalizations about any generation or people. I know that many college students do care about their world. You're thinking about what faith means amidst all that is going on around us, and what has real, lasting value. Many of you want to know what faith has to do with daily life and the search for truth. And you want to know, like I did when I was in college, whether faith and the church are relevant to the lives we're living and the difficult issues that we are facing today. I've come to say to you today that yes, faith does matter. And it's not only relevant to your life, it is meant to be lived out within the struggles and tensions of daily living and the difficult issues of the day. So I'm here to encourage you to explore these great questions of existence and what's important from the context of faith, and to find ways to address these issues of ultimate importance to the church. And perhaps when you hear how I approach these issues, you also might be willing to give the church a chance to be the community through which you live out your faith and values in this world. Because we all believe something in this world. Even terrorists believe something. And what we believe makes a great difference. And we all live according to some set of values, which can either be constructive or destructive to ourselves and others. In the Christian church, we believe that Jesus is calling us to take a risk and follow him in a way of life that holds love for God and neighbor as the ultimate value. To follow Jesus is an ultimate act of faith. For those who do are responding to the witness of people who lived a long time ago, who sat at Jesus' feet, who saw him arrested and crucified in a political execution, and who experienced his resurrection from the dead. Now, we don't share those experiences, but ultimately, if you and I are going to live the Christian life with integrity, we are going to have our own experience of the presence of the risen Christ in our lives, as we experience it through the written and spoken word, through the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper, and in the community of the church. So I grew up in the church, hearing the stories of the Old and New Testaments. I believed as deeply as I could that these stories about God were true. But I had my doubts just as much as anybody else, for I was an inquisitive student, and I seldom take anything at face value, even today. College was a great time to test those beliefs and discuss them with others. But even more important, during my life at college, I brought in my experience by learning how other people live. I worked as a musician at a multiracial Baptist church in South Minneapolis, where black and white Christians late 70s, I roomed with a man who I later learned was gay, and began to understand the fear that many gay and lesbian people have of having their sexual orientation discovered, and the prejudice and injustice that they often experience. Later in the 80s, I learned how many people throughout the world have suffered from war, violence, and poverty. When I got to know personally Southeast Asian refugees from Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia, I tutored a Hmong family in St. Paul and discovered how difficult it is to learn English when you did not receive a formal education. I also learned how much hatred there can be for refugees and immigrants who are not white on the part of people who don't understand who they are or why they live here. I learned most from my wife, Kim, who came to the United States from Cambodia in 1980. She had been separated from her parents in a Khmer Rouge work camp in 1975 when she was a teenager and while I was studying here in college, not even knowing she existed. In 1979, she and her family escaped across the border to Thailand, where they lived in a refugee camp, and she and her sisters were baptized. They arrived in St. Paul in 1980. I met them through my work at Christ Lutheran Church on Capitol Hill a few years later. From Kim and other refugees, I learned of their suffering from starvation in Cambodia and what they had to do or eat to survive. It's just like that in many places in the world. Learning their story helps me understand how people are living in Afghanistan, Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Palestine. I'm telling you this because getting to know people who have had a different life experience than me has made all the difference in the world. It has transformed me and will continue to transform me until the day I die. And the one reason that I went to seminary and ultimately became a pastor in the church was my understanding of God's call to me and to all who follow Christ to learn to love our neighbors and to be the hands and feet of God's compassion and mercy in the world. I came to see the church for all of its faults, its shortcomings, its hypocrisies, and its slowness to change as one institution that holds compassion and care for one's neighbor in the highest regard. It is the church that holds mercy and justice to be its highest calling. The church, the ideal church, and it holds it as its motto, one who gave his life for others. And it is Christians who have always taken the lead in our country in speaking out against injustice through the movement to abolish slavery before the Civil War, through the Civil Rights era in the 1950s and 60s, and the resettlement of refugees in the 1980s. This calling to do justice, to love mercy, and walk humbly with God is totally countercultural today, just as it has always been, and that is the Christian faith's great attraction to me. The church has traditionally been a community through which Christians can live out their faith and service to others, whether it's by sharing food with hungry people or collecting donations for those who suffer from disasters around the world. In local churches, Christians have meals served through loaves and fishes programs, or the Dorothy Day Center for homeless people in St. Paul. Many people bring Meals on Wheels to homebound senior citizens, tutor children in their schoolwork, or gather donations of food and clothing for local food shelves. These are common ministries, which will always be important ways for people to live out their faith in answering God's call to service. We sponsor refugees, build habitat homes, and respond to international disasters. But there is another level of God's call that is often ignored in the church, and that is God's call for justice. It was clear in the Old Testament prophets that God calls people of faith to ensure that widows, orphans, strangers, and the poor are not abused and all have enough to eat and a place to sleep. But we know that all people do not have even these basic necessities, and many continue to experience the injustices of poverty, racism, homophobia, and sexism, to name a few. Whenever we become aware of such an injustice, God calls the church to respond. So those of us with a passion for justice have a natural vehicle through the church to do our work. So how does that happen, really? I want to take a look at one simple example regarding the issue of racism. Elroy Stuck. He's a person who graduated from Augsburg a long time ago, and for years secretly sent racist letters to people of color or those who lived in interracial marriages. A few years ago, my wife and I received letters because our children were pictured in a newspaper article about their new school, which was a voluntary immigration elementary school. We received them because my wife is Chinese Cambodian, I am white, and our children are a combination of both of our ethnicities. Like many, I was tempted to throw those letters away. But not only was I a husband and a father, I was a pastor of a Lutheran church, and Mr. Stock had made reference to God and the Lutheran church in his letter. I was offended, and I saw this way as a way to speak out for justice. I wanted to make it clear that Mr. Stock's racist words could not be misconstrued as speaking for the church. So I met with his pastor, with the bishop, Mark Hansen, another Augsburg graduate, and ultimately with Elroy Stock himself, face to face, and we demanded that he stop writing such letters to people. Of course, he refused. So we went to the press. We also held a healing service for victims of racism at my church, Lutheran Church of the Redeemed. Many of Stock's victims came, and they were supported by scores of Christians from many congregations who came to show that racism is not a Christian principle. Mr. Stock was once again publicly discredited. It was not the first or the last time. But many of you probably know that public discredit has not stopped him or changed his racist attitudes, and racism does not start or end with Elroy Stock. What has become increasingly clear to me as a white male who grew up in America and in a predominantly white church, that racist attitudes have become ingrained in me. They were taught to me from birth by our surrounding society and culture, and are only overcome by intentional teaching and learning of values taught by Jesus. It is essential in the church today, and in all of our church institutions, including our colleges, that we address racism, poverty, and social justice in our nation and world, so that we do not keep repeating the errors and injustices of the past. It is also essential that those who are leaders in our church institutions, our pastors, our bishops, our church executives, college professors, and presidents proclaim that message loud and clear. And we who are leaders need to make it possible for all people of faith to participate in the work of seeking truth, doing justice, and loving our neighbors, even our enemies who we don't understand. This is even more critical today, following the events of September 11th, during the current war against terrorism, while we witness the terrible violence that happens every day in Israel and Palestine. I have found myself and my congregation increasingly involved in issues that once I never dreamed would be important to me, to answer God's call for justice. We've worked ecumenically and with people of other faiths to address gun violence in our community, to oppose racism and hate whenever they occur, to support immigrant families when unjust immigrant laws turn law-abiding people into illegal immigrants who face deportation, and even challenge our own Lutheran Church regarding its policies against ordaining gay and lesbian clergy. So this past year, my church hosted the ordination of Anita Hill, who was a speaker in this afternoon's panel discussion. And we held a prayer vigil this year for the release of Milagros Jimenez, a church worker from Peru who was jailed on an expired visa and threatened with deportation. After September 11th, we joined with other Lutheran and Roman Catholic congregations in holding an interfaith prayer service with our Jewish and Muslim brothers and sisters at St. Paul Cathedral. This work of doing justice and challenging leaders in our government and in the church is just as much a part of my calling as preaching, teaching confirmation, and visiting the sick. I'm almost done. That doesn't make the work any easier, especially since many don't share or have that expectation of the church or its pastors, and many Christians don't always agree about these issues. Many people have their impressions of pastors in the Lutheran Church from Garrison Keeler and the Prairie Home Companion, or from the movies or TV, which means that most think perhaps that Christian people of faith are either fundamentalist bigots or irrelevant comic outsiders. If the world is going to be transformed by God from a world of violence and hatred for those who are different, people of faith are going to have to take the lead. And first by being transformed ourselves into a new way of living and thinking. And we who are Christians will have to join hands in this work with people of faith who are Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists from all over the world. So I thank you for allowing me to speak today, for staying, so that I can share with you what I believe is having ultimate importance. The calling by God for the church and its people to leave our sanctuaries and go out into the world to seek truth, do justice, and love our neighbors. I hope that you will join and consider joining me in this exciting journey of transformation. Thank you.
Well, there were a lot of important things to be said today. I'm glad I was here. I've been kind of struggling here for the last 5 minutes or so, trying to figure out what songs, many songs to sing. I don't know any song that would be better right now than this one. The song was written by Bob Dylan back in the early 60s. When it wasn't for Bob Dylan, I probably wouldn't be standing here right now either. How many times must the cannonballs fly before they are forever banned? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the How many years can a mountain exist before it is washed to the sea? How many years must some people exist before they're allowed to be free? How many times must a man translate, pretend he just doesn't see? Oh, the answer, my friends, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. How many times must a man look up before he can see the sky? How many years must one man before you can hear people cry? How many deaths will it take till he knows that too many